So first of all, thanks to Mark and the organisers for the invite to speak from the kitchen this morning. So what we want to look at really for the next few minutes is just the question around feed management and its role in greenhouse gas abatement from ruminant systems. So what I want to run through for this morning is, I suppose, it's just a bit of background and context. Now, a lot of this has been covered already in the earlier webinar, so I don't want to go too much into that. But the livestock industry, the numbers and trends, and what that will mean in terms of the challenge from a methane emissions point of view. We want to look at where methane abatement fits in the current MAC, or the abatement cost curve. So also after that, we just want to take a look then also at methane abatement in grazing systems and where the current research is at from that point of view, and the potential role in particular of feed additives as an abatement strategy. And finally, just to divide the two in terms of the methane as one issue, the nitrous oxide as a separate issue. We want to also take a look at what can be done from a nitrous oxide point of view in grazing systems. Okay, so as we all know, and we've all been reading these things. It's media fodder at this stage in terms of what is happening inside the rumen and its effect on greenhouse emissions, and it's an established fact at this stage. But there seems to be some class of, I don't know, some sort of class of scatological fascination with what cows are doing in terms of their gut, and in terms of what it means for rumen methane production. So, as Mark outlined at the start, we're talking about close to 50% of our greenhouse gas emission is coming from the rumen source. Okay, so obviously that's going to be linked to cattle numbers, and particularly over the last number of years, particularly with liberalisation of milk policy, with quotas being abolished, there has been a change in cattle numbers, and as much a change as a shift in terms of the type of cattle in the country. So just to put that in some degree of context, this is just a graph, and we'll have seen this previously, but it's just tracking cow numbers, basically, or cattle numbers in the country from 1980 up to recent years. So really what we can see there is that over that period of time, and there have been various incarnations of EU policy over this period, but there was certainly a slow and steady decline from the mid-90s up to about 2010, and then in advance and since the abolition of milk quotas, cattle numbers have increased steadily since. So obviously, with methane, that's a lot of extra rumens, you could say, in the country since 2011. But you can also see that we're pretty much back in terms of cattle numbers to where we were sometime around the mid 1990s. So probably surprising to some people that total cattle numbers haven't increased beyond historical highs for sure, but still the trajectory is in a certain direction. But what's also important to remember within that context is how the balance of different systems of production is changing. Now, this is important because the rate of greenhouse gas emission, and perhaps the rate of uptake of technologies, may be different depending on the sector. So what we're just showing here is the breakdown in those numbers between dairy cows and other cows, here being beef cows or suckler cows, I suppose. If we go back to 1980, we basically had 1.6 million dairy cows in the country, quite similar to what we have now. But at that time, we basically had about 75,000 dairy farmers milking on average 18 cows each. And we had about 400,000 beef cows in the country. And as you can see, as milk quotas that were introduced, as policy changed, as there was direct payment for coupled payment for sucklers, the suckler cow numbers increased and have remained steady and maybe slightly declining since. So where are we at now? We're now in a situation where we've about 16,000 to 17,000 dairy farmers in the country milking close to 90 cows on average, with beef cow numbers per farm at about 14. So the reason that I suppose that's important is that from an extension point of view, and there was a lot of talk in some of the other webinars about the need for extension and knowledge transfer to be the key issue here, that we need to drive adoption at farm level. We have seen over the last number of years, I suppose, a professionalization, if that's a word, of the dairy sector, in that we now have a smaller number of larger scale dairy farms, still a family farm structure very much so, still kind of an owner-operator structure, small in relative to some other areas globally, but we have a sort of a full-time dairy system, and we have what could be characterized as somewhat a lot of part-time farmers on the beef side, but with some strongly focused commercial beef farmers also. So it's a slightly different, it's a different environment into which we're pushing our messages now in terms of getting adoption of technology. So that's where we are at the moment, I suppose. And if you look what that has meant for greenhouse gas emissions over that time, you can see basically that emissions are tracking stock numbers, dropping through the mid 2000s and creeping up since maybe 2013, 2014. And as you can see on the chart there, enteric fermentation being a significant part of the overall budget, close to 50%, as was mentioned. Okay. But that does beg the question. This is a real life question as to how these numbers will evolve over time. Now, the Teagasc researchers in the rural economy section have done quite a bit of work in terms of modelling out what the potential scenarios are. And this chart here is just looking at 6 different scenarios, which are basically a combination of beef cow numbers increasing or beef cow numbers decreasing, and dairy cow numbers either static or increasing. So there's a range of things going on there, but I suppose it's just, we'll see how that develops over time. And obviously, if we have situations where cattle numbers are increasing, if there's a pro rata increase without mitigation strategies, we obviously will have a large issue on the greenhouse gas side of things. So certainly the cattle numbers are one thing, but implementing the mitigation strategies across a broad base of farms is very, very important. I suppose I haven't mentioned sheep in this, obviously the other significant sector with ruminants in it. I suppose it's sheep numbers been declining over recent years. We just decided to exclude them from the forward projections, but certainly it's not to ignore the sheep sector either. So look, that's where we're going. I suppose one thing to just to be clear on, we have to be clear on this, that since the rate of change since 2015, since quotas were abolished, has been, it has been of a large magnitude. From my experience out on the ground and looking at, talking to a lot of farmers, a lot of conferences, a lot of people on the ground, and looking at business planning, et cetera, in the real world, perhaps the rate of change in the next 5 to 10 years won't be as large as it was. There was a lot of pent up potential within the system up to 2015, and a very large correction, I suppose, in terms of where numbers are at. It perhaps that heat that's there may or may not continue, but I think it would be slightly, we'd want to be cautious that we take a straight line projection based on what has happened over the last 5 years, because certainly it was a new situation where a lot of farmers found themselves in. They had scope to increase their numbers for the first time in a long time. So we just need to be careful on how we interpret the forward numbers. But anyway, look, that's where the numbers are at. But we also, and anyone who's tuned into the previous webinars, have seen a lot of discussion on the MAC, or the abatement cost curve. So this is all the measures taken together and looking at what they can do from a cumulative reduction on greenhouse gas. So you can see from 0 up to 2 million tons essentially here. Okay, so, and these are the different measures, and a lot of these have been covered previously in terms of fertilizer type, dairy EBI, which is basically a genetic index for efficiency, extended grazing, nitrogen use efficiency. They're all in there. But interesting, and just something that might strike you when you look at where the enteric fermentation of the methane production is such a large part of the overall budget. If you look here, in terms of direct dietary solutions, at the moment they appear quite small on the MAC, and there's a reason for that. We just want to go into that for a moment. All of these other issues have been verified, have been looked at what they can do in terms of delivery. But I suppose from a dietary point of view, and a direct dietary intervention, we have work to do in terms of making that a larger contributor to the MAC overall. So we just want to take a couple of minutes to look at what's actually happening out there on that. So before we just get into some of the issues and look at what direct research is out there at the moment, it is just worth remembering that, why are we bothering with this at all, I suppose, and why not just say, well, ruminants are ruminants and they're causing problems, so why would we persist with it? It is important to remember the fundamental reason for ruminant systems and why they're so intrinsically linked to I suppose, human development, societal development over millennia. The simple fact is that ruminants do convert indigestible plant fiber, so cellulose essentially, into high quality food for human consumption. So in terms of a spectrum of spectrum of carbohydrate and lignin fractions, if you go from very simple sugar up to timber, they're all carbon fractions. Obviously very digestible as sugar to totally indigestible as timber, but you come back somewhere in the middle. The human digestive system runs out of road, whereas the ruminant system can also incorporate cellulose, hemicellulose, and digest those. So essentially, what the rumen does is it converts indigestible cell wall material into high quality product, and has been very useful for human development over the millennia. So the trick is, can we, and that's where the research is looking at now, can we change or modify what happens in the rumen in order to allow this to continue, while also mitigating the byproduct of that, which is the methane essentially. So if we just look here for 2 seconds, and just to see what the actual issue is. The issue is basically, this is just a very simple diagram of a rumen. So effectively, as the animal eats carbohydrate and protein, it's the bugs or the rumen microbes that break down that cellulose and hemicellulose. Okay, they break that into usable product for the animal. So it's really the rumen bacteria that create the useful products from this otherwise indigestible material. But a byproduct of that, process is methane production. So effectively, the animal needs to get rid of hydrogen. So what does methane do? It gives them an efficient means of excreting or getting rid of that additional hydrogen from the rumen. So while we have all this good stuff down here of quality product that the animal can utilize, there is also this byproduct, and that's the issue that we need to really be focusing on. So look, management factors, and there's been a huge amount of work done on this over the years. Management factors will affect the balance of end product between, you know, the methane versus the useful product. So for example, very high fiber, too high in fiber forages, very stemmy forages would probably increase your methane production. You know, more carbohydrate, more rapidly fermentable carbohydrate would probably reduce it. Certain oils will reduce it also. Animal type and production level will change it. So an animal that's perhaps highly productive animal with a high level of intake will produce more methane, but at the same time will produce more product as well. So there's a balance between footprint and also total amount of methane produced. So I suppose those issues are all being looked at and have been looked at over the years, and essentially the more productive days an animal has, and the better the quality of the diet overall in terms of digestibility, and particularly on digestibility, the lower the relative production of methane is. However, what I suppose where a lot of the research has gone to now is to try and look at, can we use specific feed additives which would be added in a sort of grams per day level? Is there things there that could actually affect the supply of this methane, or affect the end product of methane? So effectively direct some of that energy that's now used to produce a byproduct, to direct some of that energy in a different direction for more productive use. So, you know, you've probably all seen these photographs at some stage of animals with packs on their back. So this is just basically a measurement system, the SF6 system, measuring what the methane output is from belching cows essentially. So there's a lot of work done over the years where perhaps animals would graze different diets or graze different types of swards, etc., and measure what the methane. It's just a methane measurement system. There's also in place at the moment in Moore Park the green feed system through the Vista Milk project, where again it's a feed station set up in the paddock, and it's dispensing some of these additives in pelleted form, and then measuring as the animals eat those. It measures it also measures what is what the methane output is. So it's essentially a tower to capture the emissions. Okay, so where's that at the moment? There's a range of these products being looked at the moment, and as I say, there's been plenty of research done in the past on them. The overall message, I suppose, is given how intrinsic the methane production is from a rumen point of view, so far it has proven quite difficult actually to shift methane production in the long term. There has been no silver bullet to date. It's often seen that perhaps animal production might be, or animal performance might be reduced depending on what it does to intake some of these products. The benefits might be short-lived, so the rumen has a capacity to correct itself in terms of its rumen population or its microbial population. The methane reduction levels can be variable depending on the type of animal, the type of diet. It certainly does depend on the diet. And to date, there has been relatively little work done with pasture-based systems. So I suppose that's where the research effort from a Teagasc point of view is now looking at. We're looking at certain products that are showing promise. For example, the Mutral products, 3-NOP would be another product that's perhaps useful. So the issue here is really, and that's where we're at the moment, is testing a range of products, seeing can we verify a reduction in a grazing situation, and that is important. It's not valid to just take some in vitro stuff or take stuff done on different diets and take a straightforward translation of benefit into a grass system. They have to be tested and verified in a grass system. So these additives are being tested at the moment to see what can be done. So if something shows promise and it can get credit within the inventory, it can be therefore then at that point then it can make a greater contribution to the MAC overall. So just to give an indication maybe of what the scale of difference could be, for example, some of those products have shown in and around the 15 to 25% reduction in methane. Maybe let's take 20%. So a 20% reduction in methane, if that were used across 30% of the national herd, it could reduce your methane emissions by about 1 million tonnes. So there's a big win there if it can be done. But there are, as I say, there are issues in terms of delivery of the product, verification of the product, and seeing what, are they valid long term in a grazing situation. So just as an example, and this is taken work on the 3-NOP product, which is essentially a synthetically developed product, which is what it does is, in essence, what it does is it knocks out the final step of methane production. So it ties up the final enzyme involved in methane production, which reduces methane production in the rumen overall. And you can see there, based on a control diet in red versus 3 levels of feeding of the 3-NOP product, a significant reduction in methane production over a 12 to 14 week period, which is significant. It's longer perhaps than what some of the other things like condensed tannins, etc., would have delivered in the past. So the essential point here, without getting into too much detail, is that there are products being tested at the moment. There are some products showing potential benefit. The benefits are maybe more longer lived than some of the previous incarnations, but we need to be testing a range of these, and that work is ongoing. So something like that, this type of issue would be where we're looking at having a direct effect at the rumen level. So I suppose, look, not to kill you too much with data, but just to pull in here, based on that similar diet, one of the most important things, I suppose, also is that there is no negative effect to the animal's health, the animal's welfare, or the animal's productivity. If we want these things to be adopted at farm level, we can't. It will obviously be more difficult if there's a yield or a productivity penalty. But in these situations, or when we've looked at these, the control versus the levels of dosage that would give a beneficial effect, for this product at least, the yield effect is minimal. So while we're reducing methane production, we're also holding on to productivity. So look, we're not saying that this is a silver bullet, but it's just to give a flavour, an idea of the type of work that is being done, and there will be more of these to be looked at. So look, just to put the issues on the table, verification of long-term effect is obviously the thing we need to be doing in a pasture system. We need to be working out the inclusion rates and the delivery. There's different effects in different animal types that has to be accounted for. There's also the issue of cost and is it scalable? Is it feasible to be manufacturing a product that's included in grams per day? Is it feasible to produce that at a sufficient scale that can dilute the methane emissions across millions of cattle? That's a real question. So it's okay doing it at trial scale, but it has to be scalable for really to have an impact on the industry. We also have to be careful on the production and the animal health effects, obviously on the residues and the toxicity of these issues as well. So there's a lot of work to be done, there. But as I do say, that given the changes in technology, and particularly in the ability to characterize rumen populations now, the high throughput genetic capabilities now. I think researchers are getting better at getting closer to the answer every time. So that is positive. Just finally, Mark, just not to kill us too much on time, but just to separate the methane from the nitrous oxide, which is obviously the other significant greenhouse gas. Just to give a flavour of some of the issues that are occurring there, some of the work being done. John Finn's group in Johnstown Castle in County Wexford has worked a lot over the years on multi-species swords, so diverse swords, including clovers, plantain, chicory, along with your ryegrass and maybe some timothy as well. So a diverse pasture rather than a simple monoculture ryegrass. So the idea around this would be certainly from a drought resistance point of view, from a reduction in fertilizer nitrogen. So synthetic fertilizer nitrogen can be reduced due to the nitrogen fixing capabilities of these swords. But there's also some interesting work being done in Ireland and elsewhere on the potential for these animals or these swords to reduce the nitrous oxide losses from urine patches. So there are secondary compounds, particularly in the plantain, possibly some effects at the root level as well, that show some potential in terms of reducing the nitrous oxide losses in a grazing system. So we have cattle grazing these and cows grazing these at the moment. We're looking at how they perform in terms of will they perform on the ground at field scale for production systems, and can they have beneficial effects in terms of mitigating the need for synthetic nitrogen, and also maybe having a direct effect at the level of reducing nitrous oxide losses. So interesting work being done by John and his group there. And also another piece of work done in Johnstown also on nitrous oxide, and it's the rate of excretion of nitrous oxide on pasture. So this is some Dominica Krall's work looking at how nitrous oxide emission can change between the different fractions across the season and due to different soil types. So effectively what Dominica and her group have done there is looked at where the emissions, what is the standard assumption on the emission factor within our inventory. Our standard is 2, that would be our emission factor, but Dominica has been looking and showing over a couple of seasons that maybe certainly in spring and summer, the emissions of nitrous oxide in grazing systems from urine patches might be less than the 2 for a significant portion of the season. Obviously, you can see there that urinary N in wet soils in the autumn might be an issue, but across the season, there's promise there to say that there may be potential to look at to narrow down the definitions in terms of what nitrous oxide is truly being emitted from those types of situations. Quickly on nitrogen, I know we've talked a lot there about nitrous oxide and also on methane as well, but just to make the point in terms of when we talk about grass-based systems, whether it's from an ammonia point of view, nitrous oxide point of view, or it's from a methane point of view, it is important to remember that in a pasture system that we really want to keep that as the central part of our livestock production systems. Chemical composition of pasture does change a lot over the growth pattern and over through the season as well. So it can be from a very high protein feed, high nitrogen feed, low fiber feed to a very high fiber, low protein feed, depending on the stage at which it's grazed. So that can have a major effect in terms of what's excreted from the animal based on what it's eaten. So grass is not just simply grass; it stays green, but it changes a lot in terms of its composition. So there has been a huge KT effort, a huge knowledge transfer effort over the last 10, 20 years at this stage to try to move farmers to a position where they will utilize their pasture, that they will capture as much of the energy and protein as possible, which involves correct fertilizer, grazing at the right stage, and grazing at the appropriate stocking rate. So there's a lot of moving parts. Grazing systems are not all created equal. So it's a matter of trying to hit the balance that gives us the maximum efficiencies. Okay, I mightn't go into too much detail in this, but it's just to give a point that, when we're talking about managing protein content in grass, for example, so if we graze grass too early and apply too much fertilizer, we'll have a very high soluble nitrogen fraction, which will be excreted essentially, which is waste to the system to the animal. If it's grazed too late, our fibre increases too much, which probably leads to higher methane emission potential. So grazing management is a key thing. It drives the profitability of the system, and it also can have an effect on the emissions. And in general speaking, in a grass-based system, which is a positive from a national point of view, generally speaking, it's a good feed to put protein into the system and put energy into the system. We don't really need, in most grazing situations, we don't need to be feeding certainly expensive, and definitely expensive imported protein sources are probably not needed. Perhaps a little energy supplementation for just certain times of the year. Our winter forages tend to be too low in quality, too low in protein, too low in energy. There's a big campaign needed there in terms of to improve management, to improve productivity when grass is not available in Irish pasture systems. And I suppose from an extension point of view too, also what we sort of have to do also, I think from a feeding point of view, is we do need to break this assumed link between protein and quality. I think often for years, farmers in this country and trade and even advisory, we always assume that protein equals quality. Protein equals nitrogen. Animals need nitrogen and energy, so it's not as simple as just pushing for additional protein. We need to look more at balancing our diets within a pasture system, and there's certainly no point in adding additional protein on top of what already is a system that has plenty of protein and plenty of degradable protein already available. So look, just to summarize, and hopefully you haven't gone crazy over time, to summarize, look, methane production remains the key challenge. High performance animals and diets, they do reduce the footprint per kilo of product, but perhaps the overall kilos of CO2 may increase. So it's a question of balancing the absolutes versus the footprint, essentially. I suppose the rumen-based mitigation to address the absolute emission levels is needed, and there's a lot of work ongoing on that. So far, no silver bullet. The utility of these things at a large scale has been limited by the persistence of the effects. So short-term methane drop followed by a correction in the rumen, that has limited the utility. But as I say, newer technologies are being looked at all the time. They're showing promise, whether that's the garlic and seaweed-based products, the synthetic products like 3-NOP, and we've all heard the story on seaweed also. So there are certain compounds there that are being tested and shown promise. From a nitrous oxide point of view on pasture, there is evidence that there are variable emissions due to soil, weather, and nitrogen conditions. So the straightforward average might be higher the straightforward average that's assumed might be too high relative to what's happening on the ground. There are some evidence that specific nutrients in certain pasture diets can shift nitrogen fractions away from urine nitrogen, which is where the risk of emissions comes from, more maybe to more fecal N, or so there's a possible shift there depending on pasture type and quality. So there's some potential there, and like all these things, and in conclusion, there's a huge extension effort needed across all of this stuff, Mark, to improve, certainly produce the quality of pasture and conserve forage. We need to shift our thinking on crude protein in pasture-based diets, and certainly we also need to just exercise a bit of caution when there are dozens of different options being touted around specific inclusions of ingredients for mitigation. We have to make sure that there's verification before application at industry level. Okay, I'll just leave you at that. Thanks.
Hey, Joe, thanks very much for that. Really excellent, comprehensive presentation. And you didn't bamboozle us too much. I think you explained the technology side of things very well. Joe, we'll just get your camera turned on there now. Now, we're also joined by Pat Murphy. Pat Murphy is head of the Environment Knowledge Transfer Program in Teagasc, and Pat has kindly offered to help us out with some of the questions, because what we found with these webinars is that we're getting really huge engagement from across the board. So today we have over 200 participants on our webinar, so we're delighted that the level of interest in our webinars. So Pat, how are you today?
Great.
Good.
Surviving
the lockdown. Joe, if we can ask you to switch back on your camera as well, so that we can we can take a look at the.
I think you've stopped it, Mark, have you?
Yeah, we can just switch it on
Yeah.
there.
No,
That's
we're back.
great. Perfect. Brilliant. So, Joe, just to kick things off, I suppose I have a question for you. Is that, if the dairy herd expands further, will the rate of CO2 per kg not also increase due to more intensive fertilizer and feeding, or has this been accounted for in the projections?
So not just based on the absolutes, Mark, so will the rate per cow increase also, rather than just the number of cows? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay.
So will the rate of CO2 per kilogram of product or per kilogram of milk not also increase?
Yeah, it is possible. I suppose it depends on, if you want to look at this, and there's some, Donald O'Brien had a good work done on that over the last number of years, looking at a full life cycle analysis of greenhouse gases from dairy systems, looking at intensive concentrate-based systems where there's a lot of cropping going on, maybe a lot of fossil fuels burned to move feed, because to move feed in and out of the system, and maybe more intensive fertilizer on a given area of land. Certainly, there is a risk there that the rate of emissions per head could increase. So that's really why. If you look from where the Teagasc roadmap for dairying has talked about over the last number of years, there's such a thing as an optimum stocking rate. We've never advocated for very intensive stocking rates. What I mean by intensive, I mean we've never advocated for people to stock their farms beyond the capacity of the farm to produce pasture to feed their stock, if you know what I'm saying. Now that gets lost a little bit in terms of the expansion story, but our model would always be try and retain the self-sufficiency for feed within the farm, right? By doing that, we can hold the rate of emissions per head. We would guard a lot against pushing towards systems that are reliant on imported feed, reliant on fossil fuel, reliant on farming off concrete, essentially. That has its own issues with ammonia as well as with greenhouse gas emissions. So I suppose that really depends on what way the industry wants to develop itself. Like, each individual dairy farmer has their own decisions to make, and it's not our job to tell them what they can and can't do within their own yard. But our advice has always been keep the self-sufficiency part big there. The profitability of the marginal milk and the profitability of pushing the very intensive systems is questionable anyway. So it may not be in the farmer's best interest in the first place to go to those very intensive systems. So there's a lot of reasons other than the environmental, a lot of economic reasons why you wouldn't go down that route. So I would say, yes, there's a risk that the greenhouse gas emissions per head would increase, but we would not be advocating that type of system in the first place.
Okay, Pat, have you some questions?
Yeah, I suppose a number of questions relating to the amount of research that's going on in relation to, and the type of research in relation to the products that are showing some potential. What's needed in that research to bring it to a possible market place?
Yeah. Look, this has been going on for. Research into specific ingredients has been for a long time. It's all freely available, and anyone can get out there and read what's there. There's different products. Look, you can start from things like condensed tannins, for example, specific fat inclusion, oil inclusions, fat inclusions. There was antibiotics tried for a while to try and knock out. It's the methane producing microbes that people are trying to knock out, essentially, right? So there's a lot of that has happened over the years. What I suppose, Pat, is that it's costly, and it is costly in terms of time and money to investigate every single potential additive that's out there, if you know what I'm saying. It's kind of Me Too type of stuff, well, here's another one, it's X, Y, Z, A, B, C, which one are we going to test next? So what has happened in the last number of years, I suppose, is that particularly from a microbial genetics point of view, now I'm not on this, but from talking to some people on that side of the house, there is a better capacity now to more closely identify additives or molecules that have a real chance of actually having an effect. So the 3-NOP molecule, for example, would be something like that. There's a nice bit of work done on that. So what has to happen? You have to basically use that additive in a setting mirrors as best as possible, mirrors where it's going to be used commercially. So there is no point in, for example, Ireland sort of trying to import a piece of research done on a TMR system, on a different type of forage, with a different type of animal, and just make straight line assumptions of what that's going to do here. We have to test it in a pasture system at the level of feeding and the type of diet we're feeding, because there is a difference between how these things can work depending on the base diet that they're being used in. So at the moment, through the Vistamil project in Moorpark, being led up by Lawrence Shaluta in there, there is that green feed system is in place, and they're testing a series of these things. Some of them are showing promise. It's too early to say too much about them, but they're showing promise in the way that other, I suppose, how would I say, they're the ones that have been selected for use based on other systems. They're showing good promise that in the range of that sort of 15-20% reduction. But we don't want to be saying too much about this until it's verified over time. I suppose that's the key point. So look, in a one final thing, maybe Pat, just to explain maybe why pasture diets are different. The first thing is that, you know, in dairy cows in Ireland spend their time outside eating grass. Basically, they get supplemented maybe twice a day when they get for milking at very small levels. So there's only 2 opportunities per day to deliver that feed, whereas in an indoor situation they may be eating that additive all day. So that's one challenge. And the second challenge is that Ireland's diets are forage based. It's not starch in it, so there could be slight differences there. So look, I think it's a wait and see thing, and it's the reason, as we said at the start, it's the reason why it doesn't appear heavily on the MAC at the moment. But if something comes true on those things, certainly it has a real potential to shift. It has real potential to shift in addition to everything else on the MAC. It's not that this is going to replace the other measures; it's going to add to them, I suppose.
I suppose a kind of a follow-on to that is what a question. What do you think that the acceptability to both industry and consumer of adding chemicals or other substances will be? I suppose, given what's happened I suppose particularly in relation to protected urea.
I suppose I'm just after taking a drink of a chemical. It's a chemical called water. So everything is a chemical at some level, you know. So I suppose take some of the products, for example. For example, the Mutrol product, a lot of that's based on the garlic extract and citrus extract. Okay. The 3-NOP product is a synthetic product which has its toxicity. You know, that's one of the things that has to be done. The 3-NOP product has been tested for its the risk of its toxicity risk is being assessed also. So all these things have to be for sure. There have been some issues with other additives in fertilizer, for example, on the urea side of things, not what we're using ourselves, but in a different context, in a different jurisdiction. And those things have to be tested out. So for sure, we're not going to start running around adding chemicals into feed willy-nilly. They're going to be essentially organic products that have a capacity to change something within the rumen, and they have to be verified in terms of what they mean from toxicity. That's why it takes a long time to prove any of these things, because the whole suite from what happens in the rumen to what happens in the end product has to be verified. So, but you know, we have to just be a little bit careful. We're not talking about sort of fancy chemicals here. We're talking about a lot of these things are organic extracts in the first place.
Joe, we're in the interest of time now. We're a little bit against the clock, so what we'll try and do is do a rapid fire round if we can at all possible, because we want to try and address as many questions as possible. Okay. So quick question here, Joe. What is the optimum grazing time to manage protein content?
The optimum time to manage grazing protein content is when the plant has 3 leaves. So 1,400 for people who are measuring grass, about 1,400 covers. Usually about 20 in the mid-season. In the summertime, probably between 20 days, roughly 3 weeks after it had been grazed previously. That's the optimal balance between protein and okay. Too early and you have too much protein relative to energy. Too late and you have too much fiber. So 3 weeks after it has been grazed previously.
Okay. The next question here is in relation to the you mentioned multi-species grassland in your presentation in the context of nitrous oxide, But are there benefits from a methane reduction perspective? I know obviously these multi-species grassland, they provide a more resilient sward and there's drought proofing and so on. But on the methane, direct methane side of things, is there any research to support that?
I suppose we haven't done much on that. We haven't done much on it yet. It's probably something that will happen over time. I suppose the bigger focus for the multi-species was, as you said, Mark, drought resistance, I suppose reduction of chemical N, potentially more so on the side of the nitrous oxide, to be fair, in terms of how it changes the utilization of nitrogen within the animal itself. Some evidence that the plantain, I think in particular, can change within the soil itself, can change how nitrous oxide is utilized. From a methane point of view, I'm not so sure on that just yet now, to be honest.
Question here in relation to seaweed or red macroalgae as a feed ingredient. They claim significant reductions in methane and increased weight gain. Is this approach really feasible, and any toxicity issues? You've kind of touched on that earlier on.
Because again, look, you have to just, it's a specific compound within the red marine algae for sure. And when you look at effectively what that's doing is it's knocking out the microbes in the rumen that produce the methane in the first place. The issues with that will be, I suppose, is it scalable? Can it be produced in enough quantity that it can get into the rumen of enough animals over time? And again, it needs to be tested in a pasture set and tested over a long period of time. There is no point in feeding any of these products for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and saying, yes, that had a big effect, and assuming that effect will exist or last into the future, because any of the microbial populations in the rumen, they have the capacity to recorrect themselves over time. So that is the issue. We need to test them in real world situations, and I think this is what the issue is going to be for the next while. It's going to be seaweed this week. It could be something else next week, and all these products will come forward. We have to be testing them rigorously in our own context before we can really make any pronouncements on them.
Joe, there's a question here about the stumbling blocks in relation to lowering the protein content of dairy feeds. And I suppose that the tenure of the question is that I suppose we've had a long period where we're using relatively high protein diets right throughout the year. Is the stumbling block getting farmers to order lower protein content, or is the stumbling block getting the industry to supply it?
Well, there are always three questions when you order nuts, Pat, as you know. What's the price of it? What's the protein of it? And can you deliver it before the weekend? That's the three things that people want to know. The middle question to me is sort of irrelevant, what the protein level is. Suppose, look, historically, protein has to appear on the label. It's a legal requirement to appear on the label. So there is an assumption that protein equals quality. You can have very high protein, poor quality rations, and you can have very high protein, high quality rations. So look, I think there is more and more, I think, particularly on dairy farms, more and more dairy farms have copped on to the point that it's energy content and quality ingredients that has a bigger effect than the protein percent. But protein is used as a shorthand for quality. And I think until that stops, we're still going to get people that think 18% is better than 14%. In a grazing situation, for the last number of years, 14% crude protein across the mid-season is more than adequate. We've done quite a bit of work in Johnstown on winter milk systems, which would be requiring a lot of supplementary protein over the winter period. We have dropped the overall protein in the diet down to 15% rather than 17% or 18%. In the total diet now, down to about 15%, with no difference in with productivity at all. So there's very good nutritional models out there now that can allow us to balance our diets at lower protein levels, and we should be making use of them.
Joe, there's a question here in relation to some department-funded work being carried out by Sinead Waters on additives. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on there?
With Sinead, I think with Sinead's work, I need to dig a little bit more into Sinead's work, but I think Sinead's work in particular is looking at really focusing on the metabolome, we're looking at the specific effects at a microbe level, Mark. So characterize the changes in the microbe population. I suppose, look, some of the time, this was always the problem with a lot of this stuff, where it was crude science in a way, that we fed it and we measured the methane and we see what happens at the level of the output of the animal, essentially measuring the output from the animal. Sinead's work is more to look at the steps, the intermediate steps that actually make that happen, I suppose. So looking at what changes in terms of the metabolites produced, how the rumen microbe population changes over time. Is that stable? Is that fixed? So it's the capacity to characterize, I suppose, microbial genetics and look at the populations in more detail. That's where the real novelty, I suppose, comes through his work. So I suppose it will, in time, it will allow us to get more specific answers and get a better, I don't mean this flippantly, but it'll allow us to make a better guess as to which products will work over time, I suppose. So it's much more detailed, and it's working at a sort of a rumen microbe population level, which is a great place to be at.
We're getting quite a lot of questions, Joe, about the cost benefit, particularly on the benefit side. How can we actually verify the impact of these additives on ultimately greenhouse gas accounting? And then the cost to the industry and ultimately to the farmer and to, I suppose, the end consumer.
Sure. Well, first thing, in terms of the cost to the farmer, what does methane actually do? Methane is a gas that allows, effectively, it allows end product of digestion to escape the rumen in a short. So, if the additive can alter the fermentation in a way that allows the animal to hold on to that energy, there may be potential production effects. So you're switching fermentation that has a larger amount of byproduct, which is basically, it's like the idea of smoking up the chimney, Mark, really. If we can hold on to retain more of that energy within the animal system, it has to go somewhere. So that's going to go to weight gain, or it's going to go into saleable product. So really what we're trying to do is stop smoking up the chimney effectively. From a cost point of view, again, we're talking about additives here that would be fed in grams per head per day. So it would be an specific additive that has to fit neatly into the current production system. Otherwise, I think the uptake will be small. The cost to the farmer, I suppose, if we're looking at carbon credit and we're looking at what the cost of carbon sealants are, if we can add something small into the diet that can have significant effect and I think what I mean by significant is at the sort of 20% level. That's a huge difference in terms of what our overall carbon output from pasture-based ruminant systems is. So there's a clear win there for the industry overall. The verification step, I suppose, I have been asked me that before, are the people who stand to gain most from this, they're the people who are doing the testing. But look, if we certainly haven't run away with ourselves with any of the products in the past. There's been so many products tested previously, and we haven't been jumping up and down shouting about any of them so far. So the steps will be, as again, test it, peer review, publish it, test it again, and then it's going to have to go through all of the licensing and all of the verification steps that in any industry that any step has to take. So it's certainly not easy to get this thing done. And once that's done and once it's verifiable and we have a certain emission factor established for it, then we can start looking about including it and get credit for it in the inventory. Okay, so it's a rigorous testing procedure. It's not something that we're just going to feed some seaweed for a few, think that's methane sorted. Certainly not the case. Certainly not the case.
Pat, have you a few?
Yeah, there's a question. How helpful or unhelpful is measuring milk urea nitrogen in grass-based systems as an indicator of protein levels in diet?
Milk urea levels. There is pretty much a straight line relationship between milk urea and protein as in nitrogen or crude protein content percent in the diet. Urea, effectively milk, is a means for animals to excrete surplus nitrogen also, rather than just urinary end. So certainly milk urea nitrogen does help measure. The question, I suppose, Pat, is then what affects that, or what can animals retain an acceptable level of milk urea nitrogen in a pasture system? And certainly grazing situations and grazing stock, there is a sort of an adaptation to the diet in terms of urea. I think we've seen a lot of herds where, and over a lot of years, where milk ureas become quite stable on a pasture system and within the acceptable ranges. Look, I think where a lot of issues occur with milk urea is perhaps like 2018, for example, after a drought, where there was perhaps excess nitrogen applied during dry conditions, and then when we get rain, we have a sudden uptake of nitrate into the plant. Certainly, we'll see spikes in milk urea in those situations. So milk urea will pick that up and will demonstrate, probably surplus to requirement fertilizer application. So it does reflect the crude protein in the diet, but in a large number of cases, milk urea levels become quite stable and quite fixed. They can become quite stable and quite acceptable within the normal ranges across a grazing season. So a useful enough tool, but we just want to be careful not to overinterpret the data on it as well.
We have a question which kind of indicates we're going beyond our expected scope of where we're being listened to. How effective is the use of in vitro studies for the determination of CH4 and other greenhouse gases, especially here in Nigeria, where we don't have more equipment to measure these gases? A quick comment.
The in vitro, absolutely, and it's a big part of the system here. Would be the in vitro as a screening mechanism. I suppose if we want to look at in vitro, we screen a large number of products through the in vitro system, but then when it comes to verification of those early promising results, we do then move to the animal model. So that would be the answer. So certainly in vitro is a great way to get in terms of narrowing down the potential compounds that you want to look at, and then scale it up then based on the best options based on your in vitro results. So for sure, yeah, absolutely.
I suppose, Mark, we have a few questions around other technologies, and maybe just a comment rather than a question for Joe, that as the series goes on, we'll be looking at an awful lot of the technologies have capability to reduce mitigation. So things like sequestration, land management, forestry, all of those are coming up in the series. So any of you who have asked questions about that, we will be addressing them on an ongoing basis. But I suppose we'll keep the questions here to the specific topic.
Yeah, we seem to have quite a few questions around the 3-NOP and asking about Irish trials and the timelines as to when we might see them on the market and potentially adding them to the inventory.
For me, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
Joe. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, look, again, I showed you the green feed system there that's in place in Moorpark at the moment. Measurement kit is expensive. It's not, it is an expensive process to look at these across the season. There are compounds in trial at the moment. There's a large scale study going on that in Moorpark at the moment. I would say, look, Mark, I would say certainly within the next 2 to 3 years, we will have covered a lot of those products over time. So it's again, we're somewhat limited by the scale of how many products you can test per year, et cetera, which is always the issue with research. But I think there will be a lot of new results from pasture systems available, certainly in the next 2 to 3 year timeline. I would think we would see a lot of those having covered. I would think so. Look, I don't want to do the old thing of sort of talk too much about results before the trial has even got halfway to be completed. So all I can really say at the moment is that work is definitely ongoing. There are products on the ground. There's some products that have been tested last year, and I think a lot of the data on that will be certainly through over the next 36 months.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. Pat, any burning questions there from your end before we wrap things up?
No, I think a comment there that Joe talked about the carbon intensity and the absolute emissions, and I suppose what you have there, a comment from one of our researchers, is that that the carbon footprint is steadily moving down, but to date has been overshadowed by the increase in absolute emissions due to some creases, particularly in dairy cows. And the trick is to speed one up and to slow the other down.
Fair comment, yeah.
That's fair enough. Okay, Joe, we're coming up to 10:30. I want to thank you very much for the time and effort that you put into your presentation today and the questions. There are a lot more questions there that unfortunately we don't have time for because we want to confine our webinars to within the hour. So what we might do at a later stage is try and pull together some of those questions and provide a response through our website, or indeed maybe through a future webinar.
Sure.
If you're open to that.
Very good.
So I just want to say thank you for tuning in today. I want to thank Pat Murphy for helping us out with the questions, and also in developing this program along with Andy Boland and Yvonne Maher. I also want to remind you that this will be recorded and will be available on the Teagasc YouTube channel, hopefully later on this afternoon. If you're interested in, if you want to stay in touch with Teagasc, and you can tune into the Teagasc ConnectEd digital program. If you go to teagasc.ie/connected, you can receive monthly updates on latest developments in what's going on in Teagasc, and upcoming training as well through the Teagasc ConnectEd program. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for your attention.